everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by Kelly Lynch. Again, I'm so excited to have her back with a new topic this time. Kelly is the creator of the GRIIT and POWER methods for working with her clients on mindset, resilience, identity, and problem solving, among other things. I've had the pleasure of hearing Kelly teach about these methods, and I know that you all are in for a treat today. So welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun last time, so I'm sure today will be fun too.
Definitely.
Okay, so you have said that oftentimes helping a client through clinical issues isn't about needing a new modality, but rather needing a new way to say an old thing, which is where grit and power come in.
Yes.
So let's start there.
Okay. So I've been a therapist now for a hot minute, as many of us have been. I've been doing this for 15 years and have been around a lot of different trainings and trainers. And I heard a lot of different things and learned a lot of different things about different ways of approaching how do we help our clients figure out how to navigate the problems that they face. And one of the biggest things that has always struck me is exactly like what you just said, of that we oftentimes don't need a new fancy way of approaching something. We just need a new way of saying an old thing, right? Because the old things that we've had that are tried and true and they're time tested, right? And they've stood that test of time. They are the things that typically are the foundation that all clients can benefit from, like things like boundaries and communication strategies, self-care, like managing your mindset and really understanding what it means to live in alignment with what you say you value, right? So when I developed Grit and Power, the biggest thing that I was trying to focus on is how do we take the skill sets that we all already know, right? Like Grit and Power aren't about saying a brand new thing, right? This is about reframing the things that we know into an actionable order of events that clients can use immediately, right? So I really wanted to be able to have something that clients could grab onto and go and implement without having to learn a bunch of new things or take the time to try to wrap their head around a new way of thinking about something. It's an immediately actionable plan.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And I speak often about the imposter syndrome that comes so easily to us because the work we do
Yes,
is subjective. And
right.
so I think that when we're uneasy with a client or maybe a session hasn't gone great, our mind immediately goes to, I need to take a new training or I need to learn more. I think
Right.
therapists are naturally curious anyway. Most of us, I think, are kind of like nerd out on continuing eds anyway because we
Yes.
love to learn.
Sure.
But sometimes, yeah, having some techniques so that you can acknowledge your skill set and the strengths that you have, but also maybe apply them more effectively or in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to really look at for all of us, no matter how much experience we have in the field, whether we're brand new or whether we've been doing this a million years. There's always I always say to people, you're only ever going to be limited by how creative you can be. And sometimes going and learning a new modality can be amazing and can add to that skill set to make us even more effective. And sometimes a client just needs a different way of hearing, this is how you develop a growth mindset, right? Like the basics are where people really learn how to start to thrive.
Yeah, I love that. And so what comes to mind right now is a frustrating session I had earlier today where I'm
Sure.
like, how many times have I said this over and over? So maybe I just need to come up with a different way of approaching the thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think for what it's worth, like we need to validate those moments too, because you could have. I mean, I typically my clients stay with me for many years, and
Mhm.
I will have the same conversation sometimes for 4 years going or 5 years going, and it does get really frustrating, right? And you start thinking about how can I move this forward for them or help the client figure out how to move their own needle forward. And again, it's just like you're only going to be limited by how creative you can be. So take the
Mhm.
things that you already know and just how can you shift it as sometimes ever so slightly. It doesn't need to be giant moves, right? It's just what's going to work for that particular person.
Okay, great, great. Okay. So we have grit and power.
Yep.
Do you want to kind of explain each of those for
Sure.
us? Okay.
So grit and power they serve two different purposes. I'll start there. Grit, I say to people, this is your method to use for what it means to build a foundation for living well, right? Like this is where people start to learn how to thrive. So this is kind of the overarching, what do we need to learn and what do we need to implement and practice on an ongoing basis in order to live a life that we can say we feel proud of. And then power is all about problem solving. And power is really informed primarily by my background as an EMT. So before I became a therapist, I was an EMT for 10 years. And a lot of what I do with my clients today is really colored in by that life experience as well. Then to break down the pillars of each method. So GRIT stands for growth, resilience, identity, integrity, and training. And we begin with growth because this is all about mindset, right? Like you're not going to be resilient or engaged in your value system if you don't have a growth mindset first, right? So everything builds off of itself. So we start with the growth mindset, then we work on resilience and really look at what does it take to build resilience and then sustain that, but also grow it. And then we move into identity. One of the biggest things that I find with my clients and why I chose to have identity as a pillar that really just standing on its own is that most people get really caught up in what they do and lose sight of who they are. Right. So under the identity pillar, we really look at how can we peel apart the layers of roles, labels, and then your actual identity. Well, we still provide value to the roles and labels, but let's honor what the identity is as its own thing. Then integrity is all about our value system and how can we really live into what we say it is that we value. And the last pillar, training, is all about putting our money where our mouth is, right? Like let's really implement the skills that we've learned in each of the previous four pillars and make sure that we're not just learning something new, but we're actually implementing it and actively using it on a daily basis. When we move over to power, power stands for pause for perspective, observe and organize, work the problem, express the impact, and recover. So when we pause for perspective, this is all about nervous system management, right? Like you're not going to run into a everyday life kind of problem and have your nervous system all jacked up and in fight or flight and think that you're going to solve that problem effectively or address it effectively. We
Right.
have to take that moment to really manage what it is that we're feeling so that our feelings don't get in the way of us being able to address the problem. Then observing and organizing, that comes from my EMS time. So in EMS, when you show up on scene, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to take that big picture view, right, like 360 degrees, and look at the whole thing that you're having to deal with on that particular scene and make sure you understand all of the variables and all of the factors that you're about to walk into, and then sort through that information and figure out what do you need, what's irrelevant, throw the irrelevant stuff away, right? And then out of the stuff that you need, how can you organize it into an actionable series of events? Then we move on to work in the problem, which is exactly what it sounds like. That's where we're actually doing stuff. And once we take that problem to either management, right? Because not all problems can be resolved. Sometimes we're just going to stick guardrails around it and contain it so it's not chaotic anymore, or take it to the point of full resolution if it can be resolved. Once we've hit either management or resolution, then we're going to move on to expressing the impact, which is just talking about it, right? We have to debrief from the experiences we have in the process of problem solving so that we can really look at this is how I'm affected by it, right? Problems and facing problems deplete us. So in order to come back to baseline, part of what we have to do is just process it and get it out of our system. And then the R of power is recover. And that's where we focus on self-care to not only fully return to baseline, but come back above baseline.
Yeah. Okay. So these are techniques that you designed around working with clients, but also like especially power.
Yes.
Well, grit too, actually, but both of them are good reminders for therapists about what our own needs are, what we're capable of, what our capacity is for things, how to deal with burnout and all those
Yeah.
other things.
Absolutely. I think the cool part about these two methods is that they're such foundational skill sets in each one that you can take them and you can really mold them to whatever it is you need to use them for, right? Like the application can be so far and wide. So when I was in Virginia Beach, where we saw each other recently, and I was giving my keynote talk, one of the things that I made a mention of was that that was my first keynote speech. And I was neck deep in imposter syndrome in the process of giving this talk because I'd never done it before, right? Like I've given other talks, but never a keynote talk, right? And so that's where I was using not only parts of the pillars of grit, but also using power to really make sure that I was working through that and not letting my imposter syndrome take over and get in the way of me being able to give a good talk. We can use that in our clinical work, not only on ourselves, but also with our clients. You can use it in your personal lives, right? Like
Mhm.
there's just such a wide array of how you could apply this.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. Okay. So, can you give some specific examples of like working through each of those with somebody?
Sure. So I actually have a client right now who we are in the midst of processing a major loss. And the thing that we're focusing on the most in the process of dealing with this loss and figuring out how to navigate it is maintaining a growth mindset and not losing sight of the resilience that this person has built over the years that we've worked together. Because this loss is so life-changing for this person that it would be very easy for this person to completely regress in the work that we're doing. So the mindset piece and the resilience piece are pivotal to the work that has to be done right now. So the biggest thing inside of resilience is looking at the 7 C's. Now, I don't have the 7 C's memorized. It is in my book. You can Google it. It's on the
That's good.
internet in places. But the 7 C's were developed by, gosh, I believe his name was Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, I want to say, out of Pennsylvania. And he's a pediatric doctor and researched how does resilience develop in children as they grow up. And what he ended up finding was that there were 7 main areas that kids ended up needing to really focus on and be supported through in order to develop resilience into adulthood. The two most important ones, I believe, are competence and confidence. And
Mm.
so, in the process of looking at resilience with this particular client that I have, that's what we're talking about, right? Of that, how can they maintain a level of confidence in themselves that they believe they can face this loss and not have it consume them, right? And so, when we look at that kind of work through a growth mindset and resilience, right? It's kind of like 1 + 1 = 2.
Mhm.
Resilience and a growth mindset, or a growth mindset plus resilience equal, they're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's taking me right back to my pediatric hospice days at the very beginning of my career.
Uh-huh.
And, the initial assessment was about figuring out what the family strengths were. What have they
Yes.
overcome together? What have the things, what are their supports? What are their resources? Discovering all
Right.
these things because this is going to be an excruciating experience for them.
Sure.
But I love the expression. They've survived every worst day of their lives. And so we have to figure out what those tools were, what the resources were. And
Right.
I love using a strength perspective because I think it's so empowering for the people we're working with.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that a big part of that too, and another one of the C's, is connection, and really looking at what's the strength and the connections that they have and how can they lean into that. So that's another thing that I'm doing with this particular client that I mentioned. But that's one way that you could use at least a few pillars of grit in the process of working with challenging clients.
Mhm. That's wonderful. So what about power?
So with power, it really, I have a different client right now who is a paramedic. And one of the things that we're navigating is how can they communicate more effectively with their chief?
Mm.
Because the chief is a good person and they're a good leader in terms of really caring about their employees and the folks that are in the department. But in terms of departmental policy and stuff like that, they're not necessarily the greatest leader. And this particular person is very challenged by that. So being able to communicate effectively with their chief so that they protect their job and protect their reputation in the department, that's where power comes into play. So that's where we're looking at, okay, what is the particular problem today that you want to go talk to the chief about? And how can you look at what are the factors of that problem? So there's observe and organize. What factors matter? What factors are irrelevant, right? Leave the irrelevant stuff to one side because you're wasting your time, right? Or blowing hot air. And then working the problem is the actual conversation. So that's where we look at communication strategies and how can we bring the chief solutions that this person could also present and say, look, I'm having a problem, but I'm invested in resolving it. Then when we go to expressing the impact, that's where we look at debriefing, right? Because in the first responder world, we're going to call it a debrief. We're not going to call it processing, right? And so when we talk about that part, that's where we look at how can you go to a confidant or a trusted friend and debrief your conversation with the chief so that you can, if it didn't go well, you can blow off some steam and let it out in a way that's safe with a person that you know is also safe for you. And then recovery is go exercise, right? Go work it out, literally and figuratively. Get that energy out of your body so you're practicing good self-care and you can go back to work for your next shift in a way where you're cool, calm, and collected and not creating a problem.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important, empowering, one of the pillars is so empowering because in the groups that I facilitate with therapists, I hear things like, well, if I go on vacation, I'm abandoning my clients, or,
Right.
if I don't see everyone when they need to be seen, like at 10 o'clock at night. And,
Mhm.
and I like to remind them that outpatient therapy is the lowest level of treatment there is. And our
Yeah.
goal is not to be the end all be all for our clients, but you're teaching that person who is that go-to person that you're going to debrief with, because that supports us in knowing that, okay, we've given our client the tool to know they can do that. And we've also sort of, in doing that, set the boundary that I'm not the only person that's going to support you around this. You have other
Right.
resources.
Exactly. And I think that's an important point for all of us to remember. I always say to my clients at the intake, my job, if I'm doing my job well, what's going to end up happening here is that you're going to break up with me, but you're going to
Yep.
break up with me for the right reasons. And we need to get to that point, right? It may be years down the road if there's really a ton of stuff for us to address, but we need to get there. And what is that going to look like when we get there? So it means really taking the time to teach our clients that, like you said, we are not the end all be all, and that they need to have tools and people and connections out in their community where they can stand on their own 2 feet, right? And be able to manage the things that they face in their everyday lives because we're not there all the time and we shouldn't be.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So you work with a lot of first responders, the
Mhm.
MT community in particular. Are there particular, like other than that population, are there particular clients that these methods work the best with?
I think they work great with everybody, honestly.
Everybody. Yeah.
I,
Yep.
I really like also using them with entrepreneurs though. I find that entrepreneurs, we're a funky bunch, man. And when we look at the entrepreneurial world, there are so many different directions that you could move your business in. And every single direction you could move your business in has a ripple effect to your life. Just the same as every single direction you move your life in has a ripple effect to your business. And I really find that in my connections with entrepreneurs, and I would also say with executives as well, there are an overwhelming number of possibilities for the choices that you could make on a day-to-day basis. And so that's where we really need to look at how can we implement power to make sure that we're problem solving those choices and being effective in the process of making decisions, because there's just a myriad of things that we face. Just the same as that, I find that a lot of entrepreneurs and executives also do really well at work, and then things come, like the wheels come off the cart when they go home,
Mhm.
right? And that's actually one of the biggest crossovers that I find between my first responder community and my entrepreneurial community that I work with. Their professional lives are thriving, right? And they're killing it at work, but their
Mhm.
home lives are falling apart, right? Because their role in what they do has taken over and they've forgotten who they are. that's where grit comes in. So, I mean, I really believe that these two approaches and methods could be applied in all populations. This is what I personally have seen work best.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm thinking of like people pleasers and overachievers and all those people that just
Totally.
constantly put so much on themselves and
Yes.
teaching them these skills. So when you work with clients, do you teach them like this is grit and this is what it stands for? Or is it more
Yep.
you using this in your process?
Both. So I
Okay.
use it in my process, but I also teach it to my clients. And we really look at first doing a lot of psychoed about each method and breaking down it in great detail, each pillar and what's included in each pillar, the theories that go into it, why those theories matter, what are the skill sets that support each pillar, and so on and so forth. But then as we talk about different things, I point out, like if a client is coming to me and saying, I'm really having some issues with my chief, I'm going to ask them, okay, what is it about power that you could use to address a problem effectively? How can you use that to support your communication with this chief? So we're constantly thinking about it and working on it in addition to breaking down the pillars.
Yeah. So that's giving you tools, but it's giving your clients tools and it's really
Mhm.
specific. And you can, as you're teaching them that, teaching them with their own life in specific examples in their own lives.
Right, right. And I find that a lot of people really like to have, at least in my experience, a lot of clients really like to have very concrete things that they can grab onto and say, okay, I know what to do with this. This idea makes sense to me. Now, what is it going to look like to go and implement it? And it's really like the psychoed piece is short. It doesn't take a lot of time because the skill sets aren't hard, right?
Mhm.
So then really the crux of the work is the implementation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we cited the power of psychoeducation. Sometimes we're
Mhm.
just doing it so naturally, we sort of forget that's what we're doing. And a lot of times, especially I think with newer therapists, there's this desire to jump in and start getting some progress right away to prove yourself,
Right.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
When you need to, like, so it's just like, let's not skip building rapport. That's really important. Let's not
Right.
skip some psychoeducation. That's really important. The
Yep.
progress is going to come and it's going to be more effective if we
Right.
set things up the right way.
Right. Right. I say to all clients coming into my practice, I give me 1 month of weekly appointments, right? Most of the clients in my practice I see biweekly. So I have a higher caseload because I don't see all of them on a weekly basis. But I say to everybody, give me 1 month of weekly appointments because that's where we're going to build a relationship. And that's where we're going to front load skill sets and do a lot of teaching. All right. So that
Mhm.
first month in my practice, the way that I work is critical because that's where that's happening.
Yeah. And you're also working with a population that's sort of, they're taught and modeled that just, you got it. You don't need help. You can make this work. And so
Right,
there's
right.
sometimes some stigma with reaching out for help. So, like
Sure.
when I worked with teens who didn't want to be there, I would get their buy in. I would say, give me 4 sessions.
Right.
Um, if you hate it, we can tell your parent you tried. But by the end
Yep.
of the first session, they're like, there's an adult who's going to listen to me for an entire hour.
Yeah.
I'm
This
coming
doesn't
back.
suck. Yeah, yeah.
And I would imagine some of your clients, the EMTs you work with as well, they're not used to having, like, they're used to being the ones who are supporting others.
Right.
And to have somebody who's saying, like, I got you. We're going to go
Hmm.
through this together.
Yeah.
And then you get the buy in then.
Right, right. With the first responder population, the biggest thing that they're looking for is that they can talk about the job without having to take care of their therapist and talk about
Hmm.
the kind of the really hard, dark parts of the job, right? Like there's a lot of horrific things that first responders see. So they want to be able to talk about that without the therapist falling apart. And then they want to be able to look at their therapist and say, I don't have to explain the job because you already get it, right?
Right.
And so I like that's something I'm able to offer to my folks. So that's where the buy-in comes in on my end with my first responders. But yeah, absolutely. To just be able to be heard and
Hmm.
not feel like they're a project for
Yeah.
a therapist to go in and be like, oh, I'm gonna fix them, right? Because they're not broken.
Right, exactly. And I've done a series of episodes recently where talking about the culture of certain professions,
Sure.
understanding the culture so you don't do harm. And that,
Right.
generalists who sometimes they don't have a choice. They have to take whoever comes in the door, need to
Right.
understand that there are certain cultures that you need to do a little research. You need to look into some stuff to make sure that
Absolutely.
you're supporting them. I had a client who said they went to a therapist and they were describing this horrific thing. And the therapist like broke down in tears and left the room and said, like, I can't hear this.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
was like, that's a really good thing for a therapist to know.
Right.
Because if they come in with a presenting problem, like around something like that, you need to know, okay, I either have to talk to my supervisor about a reassignment for this client, or I have to
Right.
say, I need to find a better therapist, a better fit therapist for you, because
Sure.
I'm not sure I can give you what you need.
Right, right. Well, and I think for what it's worth, those are the moments where as therapists, we can also use grit to get back to that, to really be able to keep ourselves in alignment with what it is that we value in terms of what we want our clinical work to look like. Being able to remember, okay, here's what my value system is under that integrity pillar. To say, I want to work with first responders, or these are not my people, and that's okay, right? To
Yes.
really let that be acceptable because not every client should be the right fit for us.
Right. And that's so empowering to learn that, because we are taught that it's all about the client, meet them where they're at, do what they
Right,
need, and we're
right,
not given that idea that we are not doing our best work, therefore the client's not getting the best service. And then we're impacting our entire client load because we're burnt out and not feeling comfortable. And so it's okay to recognize these are the people that are in my zone of genius. And these
exactly.
are the people that I'm going to struggle with or don't have the skill set for. And it does not speak badly on me to say,
Right.
I can find you a referral that's going to be a better fit.
Yeah, because sometimes that is the best care that we can provide to somebody to say, like, I'm just
Mhm.
not it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So, is there any other information you want to share about grit and power that we haven't covered so far?
That's really it. Like that's the big stuff, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The thing that I love about these methods and why I get so excited to be able to offer this to clinicians, to clients, and just to anybody who's willing to listen to me, is that they're not hard, right? Like there's information inside of each pillar, there's teaching that needs to be done inside of each pillar, but this is stuff that anybody can use, and these are foundational skill sets that we all can benefit from, whether it's in our clinical practice, our personal lives, how we show up as business owners in private practice, or if you work in an agency, how you communicate with your supervisors or program managers. There's application for this everywhere. But I really just would emphasize to anybody listening, this is the stuff that you want to keep simple, right? Don't overcomplicate these things because foundational skill sets are simple on purpose.
Okay. And so you have a book that so there's a plug. We'll have the information in the show notes because it's excellent. So I'm wondering if so you're talking about simplifying, which made me think of like Janina Fisher's like flip charts for trying to explain some different aspects of trauma, which
Uh-huh.
might be a like an idea for you there to create a resource. And I'll have
Yes.
that line because I'm thinking, oh, well, this would be good for the therapist to have, but maybe they could also, you know, let their clients know about, but that might be bogging them down too much. So do you find, I guess it probably depends on the client, whether or not you would recommend this to the client or not.
Right, right. I think it really, the best answer is it depends, right? You have to look
Hmm.
at each individual person and what their individual needs are. And there's certainly some people that I see clinically where I'm not going to tell them, okay, I'm teaching you grit and power, but I'm certainly going to talk about every single skill set in every single
Hmm.
pillar, right? So we're
Right.
still doing grit and power.
Hmm.
We're just doing it in a way that meets that particular person's needs.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Okay. Well, I have loved hearing about this. I think this is going to be super helpful information for our colleagues out there who are listening. And I have seen you speak several times, and it's always been wonderful.
Thank you.
So, besides reading your book, are there other ways that people can work with you?
Sure, you can head on over to my website at www.thegritproject.com. Just make sure you spell grit with 2 I's. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram. My handle is the same. It's at I am Kelly Lynch on both platforms.
Great. Okay. All right. So, can you tell us if you have a favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use with clients?
There's so many.
I know most of us have a lot of those in our back pocket.
Yes. So I said one while we were talking, that you're only ever limited by how creative you can be. I say that to my clients all the time. But another one that I really like to share with my clients to remind them of what the work is that it's not hard. It's just hard.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And so when we say it's not hard, right, like I really like to break it down to people that that's just logistics, right? Like that's the black and white stuff. It's not the logistics of the things that we work on with our clients. They're generally not hard logistics, but the it's just hard part, that's where all the emotions come into play. And that's the gray, right? So
Yeah.
the black and white is easy to navigate. The gray is not, right? So it's not hard. It's just hard.
Yeah.
And if
It's
you break it down like that, like it validates people's experience, I think.
Yeah, and I think you're also honoring what we frequently see is sometimes things get worse before they get better. And
Sure.
so just letting them know that we're it's not hard. We're gonna like manage these logistics, but it is hard. Like this
Yeah.
isn't gonna be a walk in the park all the time.
Right. I would put it on the same level as it's okay to not be okay, right? Of just like
Right.
it's a
Yeah.
validate your experience and it's all
Yeah.
right for you to feel whatever it is that you feel.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. You have shared the ways people can connect with you, so I will be sure to put that in the show notes. And for all of you hardworking therapists out there, please remember our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.